Okay.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, welcome to another session on the quantum computing meetup in collaboration with Toronto, Washington, and Warsaw Quantum Computing Meetups. My name is Il, and today we will have Professor Vedral speaking today, who is the professor of quantum information science at the University of Oxford, where he will outline a sequence of experiments that would test the notion of quantum measurement. For instance, is it possible that a definitive measurement is made while the overall state of the system and the apparatus remain in a superposition? The standard classic rules of inference fail here, and you'll discuss a recent quantum optical proof of principle demonstrating this fact. They're conceptually more interesting and experimentally more challenging questions. Can a human entangle two emitting dipoles just by observation? Can a human observation execute a Bell state measurement that leads to teleportation of a state of light to another human? Can observer of observers consciously know about the detection of entanglement between other observers and the observed, while the observers themselves are not conscious of the observation in the first place? Quick bio on Professor Vedral. He is the professor of quantum information science at the University of Oxford. Previously, he was the professor of physics and principal investigator at the National University of Singapore and was a chair professor at Tsinghua University. He has published over 400 research papers on various topics in quantum physics and quantum computing and is one of the Clarivate highly cited researchers. He has given numerous invited plenary and public talks during his career. These include a specialized talk at a Solvay meeting in 2010 and a popular one at the International Safe Scientifique at 2007. Right. He was also awarded the Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award in 2007, the World Scientific Medal and Prize in 2009, the Marco Jarek Award in 2010, and was elected a Fellow of the Institute of Physics in 2017 and a member of the European Academies of Science in 2020. Right. That is basically everything. And without further ado, Professor
Thank you.
Blacko Vedral.
Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to be invited yet again to talk to you. It's nice to address the interested community, obviously, in this way and have a global reach. So I want to talk about this topic because I think it's an interesting direction. And I think it is a general trend to take quantum mechanics out of the microscopic domain and really test it in the macroscopic domain and see whether, obviously, that's what we as physicists are interested in, whether it survives, whether all the features survive, whether it fails in a fundamental way that it needs to be modified. So we have already, having said this, we have, of course, seen a number of directions in chemistry. That's a very natural thing for quantum physics to do, because already at a certain level of complexity, you have to start taking genuine. So it's not just structurally important in chemistry, but obviously, so there is chemical bonding, of course, which is all quantum mechanical. But certain things in chemistry may, in fact, be coherent in terms of dynamics, for instance, over periods of time that may be surprising to us at first sight. And we really need to understand how come they manage to maintain, let's say, quantum coherence over the time scales or distances or whatever else it is that we are interested in. And through chemistry, of course, you are naturally going into biology. And so some people talk about quantum biology as a field. In a sense, it is a field, but the point I'm making here is that we still don't really have any definitive evidence that there are genuine quantum effects at play. And this has to do with a subtle fact that of course, controlling complex systems in a biological domain is extremely difficult. And if you have a handful of parameters that you are able to extract experimentally, but the complexity of your system requires much more than that to be described, then there are various models, in fact, which you can use to explain the behavior that's observed. And whenever someone claims that there is a quantum mechanical effect, usually you get someone else who actually says, well, wait a second, I can really model this with a chain of coupled harmonic oscillators, and the whole transport can be accounted for classically. Incidentally, most of you may follow quantum computing, and I think it's a very similar trend that every once in a while someone announces that there is a genuine quantum advantage, and here is a computation that no classical computer can do. And then almost invariably within a week or so, someone comes up with a very simple classical simulation, which is much faster than the quantum mechanical one. So in that sense, we don't have definitive evidence, but I think there are high expectations, and there are reasonable expectations that sooner or later we will get, of course, to the level where this is clearly happening. And then the last point that I made on this slide, before I really go into the direction that I find interesting, and the one that featured in the abstract as well of my talk, is that most of these experiments are, of course, still done in chemistry and even in biology under controlled conditions. So, for instance, people who study spin chemistry, they study the effect of the external magnetic field on how chemical dynamics unfolds and which chemistry gets expressed when the field has a certain configuration. Now, of course, we know that quantum mechanics is crucial here, and it's all about entanglement between different spins and the singlet triplet conversion and things like that. And so all of these things have been tested quite conclusively in the lab, in vitro. However, there are many suggestions that in fact this occurs in the natural world, and lots of these mechanisms are present out there. But once you really face having to test living systems to really prove that these effects are genuinely quantum, then of course it's a completely different ball game. It's just much more complex. Like I said, you have access to a very tiny number of parameters. You cannot control most of the other things. And the stochastic element simply plays a huge role here. But be this as it may, I think it is a very interesting direction to take. And of course, that's what we are all curious about. And that's what I put there as the bottom line, that, and this will be a personal statement now, because I want to communicate my own feeling about quantum mechanics, and I don't think it's necessarily the consensus view. In fact, there isn't probably a consensus. That's what's interesting about the foundations of quantum mechanics. So I think that there is simply no internal inconsistency in treating everything quantum mechanically. So in fact, I can put it more strongly. The only way to consistently account for the present state of affairs in physics is to apply quantum mechanics fully to the whole universe. Any semi-classical treatment is ultimately problematic, even at the conceptual, at the theoretical level. You simply are unable to account for certain things. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not the way it's going to go experimentally. But the point I'm trying to make here, and it's the one that's made almost always in the opposite direction. Everyone, whenever I open YouTube and I look at the discussion, someone says, oh, quantum mechanics cannot be right. It will collapse and all of these things. And I'm trying to now communicate the exact opposite, in fact. And that's what motivates me to go in the more complex direction. So certainly there is no internal inconsistency. Everything can be accounted for. And yes.
Because as I understand, we can do two things, two directions on this topic. Yes. So first is that we know that we have some classical effects, and as I understand, you show or will show that this classical effect is some effective way of quantum effects.
Yes.
But maybe we can go in the other direction, that we can take classical effects and try embedding it to the quantum frameworks. Yes, like in we have in machine learning that you take, for example, graph data or something like that, and you embed it to the vector space because you want compute metrics, you want compute something. Yes, so
Yes.
maybe better direction is that okay, there is some quantum effects, some classical effects, but if we use our quantum formalism, it will be better than just classical formalism.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly a possibility. I fully agree with that. I think I'm making a far simpler point in many ways, and it's simply to do with the fact that that the motivation that something is logically inconsistent within quantum mechanics, and there are many people who claim this and many papers written on this, is not a good motivation in my view. It's just simply it's a fully consistent theory. Consistent simply means you're not going to get two orthogonal predictions for the same so you're not going to do one calculation that says yes and the other one that says no, and it's consistent in this way. It's also complete in the sense that you can ask anything and it will give you an answer within this theory. Now, it doesn't imply that it is the right description ultimately. In fact, lots of us are hoping that by probing this in the macroscopic domain, we will get to a new theory. But somehow the point I'm making is that it is perfectly okay as it is, logically speaking. It does violate, of course, classical logic. And you are right that I'm thinking of classical physics as a very special case of things being embedded within the quantum description, but somehow having certain selection rules that prohibit you from, let's say, superposing things or measuring certain observables, whichever way you want to talk about it. So absolutely right.
Yes.
So it's just, let me continue.
Eric, if you have some question,
I'm stopping.
good question, but not this way, okay? This is
let me continue.
Yes.
I'm saying things in a deliberately provocative way, and I expect this response, and that's not a problem at all. In fact, I like this kind of engagement, but I'm just concerned that we won't get to the meat of what I'm trying to say. So let me outline what I have to say, and I can even comment on these other things that I claim don't exist in quantum mechanics. So here is a very simple, the usual Schrodinger's cat, and I'm gonna take you through what I'm trying to communicate now is that it's perfectly okay to for everything to be in a superposition at the global level. In fact, a highly entangled state, if you like to talk about it more specifically. However, this doesn't prevent us from talking about definitive outcomes to measurements, and then even showing that they could be interfered. So that's something that I think many people don't realize. And if they realize it, they dismiss it because they think it's too complex to do anything like this. But in fact, logically speaking, is dead simple. Logically, I will boil it down to an experiment that's only worth 3 quantum bits. Anyone can do it. It requires a handful of gates. So there is no problem with it. That's what I mean by consistency of this. Now, whether this is how human perception really functions, I have no idea, honestly. But I don't think you can logically argue that there is a problem with this. So I'm saying it's a completely consistent picture. Whether it happens to be true as far as nature is concerned is exactly what we want to know. That's why we do physics. So I don't know that, but I'm just saying it's a bad motivation to think that making a measurement collapses quantum mechanics, collapses superpositions, entanglements, and so on. In fact, quite the contrary. Making a measurement establishes further entanglement. So this is all there is to this. And it's a very interesting thought experiment, which is an extension of Schrodinger's experiment. And I want to talk about this because I want to then show you how far we could maybe go with these ideas. And to me, they sound very adventurous. You know, neuroscience has been developing very rapidly. They can do tests that are more and more sensitive, and they have been doing. And you know, who's to say that within the next decade or so we may not be able to test even some rudiments of these kind of things. I don't know. It's just wide open as far as I'm concerned. So basically, in Schrodinger's cat, you simply, I mean, initially Schrodinger made the point thinking that this must be absurd. However, later in his life, he changed his mind completely. In fact, he was a many worlds person before Hugh Everett. It's just that his lectures were published posthumously. And so somehow people didn't immediately appreciate the fact that Schrodinger thought that ultimately the best description is the one that's fully quantum mechanical. And there is no inconsistency. In fact, he liked it precisely because there are no weird things like collapses and quantum jumps and things like that. So the Schrodinger cat simply says you have a superposition. Here, of course, it's a photon, but it doesn't matter. And for what I have to say, you don't have to stick to the original experiment. Any superposition of a qubit is enough, providing it can couple to a more complex system, which happens naturally if you look at the state of this qubit, or in this case, the photon. So you have a photon which is going through an interferometer. And you have a cat in Schrodinger's case. But what I would like to do is put a system that you can communicate with more faithfully than with a cat. That's the only reason why I'm mentioning AIs or humans. So I want a system that's capable of registering something. Surely every living system is capable. Definitely cats are capable of that. But of course, it's difficult to then probe the cat to see what kind of perception has actually taken place. And Schrodinger's point was, look, if I apply my own equation, if I apply Schrodinger's equation to this situation fully, to the whole experiment, then in fact, I must acknowledge that in one branch, the cat will see the photon going one way, and in the other branch, the cat will see the photon. He imagined dead and alive cat to make it even more dramatic, but it doesn't matter. For the logic of quantum mechanics, you may simply assume that the cat detects a photon going down one arm of your interferometer or going down the other arm. And he made the point that somehow quantum mechanics suggests that both of these take place. And that's interesting. So can you test it? What does that even mean? So here is this variant.
Can I ask you about one thing? But
of course,
because I see that in this picture, you treat state vector or wave function as something.
no, it doesn't have to be a wave function. It could be a mixed state.
But
totally irrelevant.
No. I think that you treat this state vector or something like that, or wave factor, doesn't matter. It's that it is strictly connected with physical and biological things. But okay, but
yes, I'm assuming. Yeah,
you know, but we know that there is no. It can be that your system is described by something that doesn't exist, like for example.
Correct. And I think that's exactly what we are also testing here. That's a beautiful point that you are making, which is why I'm saying all the time that I'm completely open-minded as to the future of quantum. I actually don't mind if quantum mechanics fails. In fact, I'm very happy if we get a new theory, but I don't think it will fail by collapsing back to classical physics. That's all I'm trying to demonstrate here. You're right. I'm treating perception simply as some kind of record inside a complex. It could be a computer. I could have a quantum computer inside instead of a cat. It's completely irrelevant, so long as I can do a following thing, which I'm about to explain. That's why this is worth 3 qubits. It's extremely simple. logically, you only need 3 qubits, and I can take you through that. So you're right. If our perception, or if anything in biology goes beyond the current physics, this will fail, or it may fail, may not fail. It could go the way I'm predicting, and still there is more to biology than just physics. All of this is possible. I have my own intuitions how I think this will go, but actually all of this is possible. None of this is ruled out by what I'm saying. The only thing I want to confirm is that it's possible to have a definitive outcome and still be in a superposition. Sounds like a violation of the uncertainty, but it's not. And that's what many people miss. In fact, most people don't understand what I'm about to say, which I think is why it's worth communicating. Incidentally, there is a subset of quantum information that thinks of this as obvious and trivial. So I know that when I talk to certain people, they will say, obviously, what else can it be? So that's how divided the whole opinion is, and that's what's exciting about this. So let me press on with this now. Imagine there's now the Alice and Bob. But again, I'm using humans simply because a human at the moment only knows how to faithfully communicate more or less with another human. We don't really know how to engage. Could be a computer, that's true. Could be an AI, we can communicate. But we don't really have a good intuition what's going on necessarily in that black box, if you like. So I'm imagining 2 humans, but it doesn't have to be, as you will see from the quantum circuit. Very simple. So there is Alice, who is controlling the whole experiment. Alice is outside of the room. And Bob, you can forget the cat, by the way. Once you have Bob is the one looking at the photon and registering whether the photon is in one arm of the interferometer or the other. He can put detectors even. And if he gets click in one arm, or he can look directly. This is what I want to suggest later. In fact, human eye could, in principle, detect a very low number of photons. So you could think of a variant of this experiment that actually goes directly in the human eye and the perception. And I don't think there's anything. It's possible indeed that our brain does something more than that. But at the interface of our vision, it would be very surprising if this wasn't just, some basic quantum physics there, at least at the interface. I mean, I don't know what happens in the brain, and I'm fully open, like I said, to anything. Certainly, it will conform to the laws of physics. I think it would be surprising if it didn't. That's the bias that I may have. Okay, so Bob registers the photon. Now, what Alice wants to show is exactly what Schrödinger claims, namely that Bob is now actually entangled to the photon. So if the particle goes one way, Bob sees in that branch the particle going that way, but in the other branch, there is a different state of affairs in Bob's perception, and he sees the particle going the other way. But it's not just classically either or, which is usually how we are taught these things. You make a measurement, you get either this or that. Schrödinger says, no, you get both. There are two versions. We don't even have a good language. And I think lots of the animosity towards this comes from the fact that we don't have the right language even to express these things. You can see that I'm even struggling whether to use an and or an or and so on, but I mean it in a I mean it the good old quantum superposition. So basically, Alice now wants to cleverly probe whether Bob made an observation, but without learning. So you want to avoid what people call the Wigner's friend. Alice doesn't want to get entangled to Bob, because if Alice gets entangled to Bob, she's stuck within these orthogonal worlds, if you like, with orthogonal branches. Let's use a less harmful language, okay? So now what Alice does, and this was the suggestion of David Deutsch, Alice says, why don't I just put a piece of paper underneath the door which says, Bob, do you see a definitive outcome? So she's not asking did the photon go left or right after the beam split? She's simply saying, did you see a definitive state that it's either left or right, but definitely either one or the other? And the interesting thing, and this is what quantum mechanics predicts, collapse theory doesn't predict, collapse cannot deal with this. And that's how you can discriminate genuine collapses from genuine quantum treatments. So basically, quantum mechanics says, in both branches, Bob will simply answer yes. So Bob seeing the photon going one way will say, yeah, I see a definitive outcome. Bob seeing the photon going the other way, yeah, I also see a definitive outcome. So the piece of paper will simply contain yes as an answer to this question. And that's very interesting. So now how would Alice confirm that Bob really existed in both of these branches? Well, this is the difficult bit experimentally, but logically, conceptually, she simply has to interfere these two possibilities and see whether she gets back to the original state of affairs or not. So it's your usual interferometer. It's just that the interferometer with a single photon is trivial, but an interferometer that includes observers or whatever else you need from the environment is extremely difficult to reverse. And that's really what's preventing us from this. If we knew that there was a small part of Bob's brain, which was the only relevant bit to control quantum mechanically, then we could do this experiment now. That's how easy it is. That's what I'm now saying. And we have no idea actually how complex this whole thing is really, but we don't understand any of this stuff. So that's interesting. A collapsed person would simply say, when you make a measurement, you get one outcome or the other, you can never interfere them. Schrodinger says, no. A measurement is just enlarging your superposition. It's still in a superposition. It's entangled. Bob here sees the photon going one way, there sees the photon going the other way. And now, if Bob wasn't as complex as that, you could imagine that there is an experiment which reunites these two possibilities and sees which way the things unfold ultimately.
Can I
So
make a question?
Yeah, of course.
Because I'm more the person who believes is very bad words, but I'm traditional quantum mechanics thinks that okay, so because you say that after measurement we can have not only one state vector but many in superposition. Yes,
measurement is simply a correlation of
okay,
whatever is the device. It's like a control. Think of it as a control knot.
But my question is that, okay, because we do this collapse because we have simple interpretation of these elements that we get, agent value for one vector, we get probability.
Yes.
So if in your picture, how you interpret this? Sorry for my son.
Yeah,
no. The result of
it's a good question to clarify because otherwise maybe I'm going to make it even slightly more complicated. The point is this, that in this picture, the outcome that Bob does not see, okay, so let's put it that way. Let's use your language. Bob says, oh, I look at the photon and now I see it in the left-hand arm of the interferometer. What quantum mechanics says, this is the standard quantum mechanics. That's the whole point that I'm making and Schrodinger was making and many other people are making. What quantum mechanics says is that the outcome that Bob doesn't see can affect the future experimental result. This is the statement that if you understood it, you would understand exactly what I'm trying to say. So basically, Bob, let's say he happens to be in the branch where he sees photon on the left. What quantum mechanics says, if it's true, I'm only conditioning it that it's true at the global level. It can apply to everything. It says even the outcome Bob didn't see in that branch, namely the other the other side of the interferometer, can affect, if you can do the unitary to interfere them, can affect the future outcomes. And that's very interesting, okay? So basically, imagine, let me give you a very stupid example. Just let me give you the stupidest example. Let me conclude with this, just to make it, because what I'm saying is completely logically consistent. It's just that any hang-ups that anyone might have about this is simply not following through the quantum logic at every level. So imagine you're coming towards a beam splitter. Someone is doing an interferometric experiment with you, okay, whichever way this happens. You're coming towards a beam splitter. And someone says to you, which way are you going to come out? Left-hand port of the beam splitter or right-hand port? Now, you may be thinking, well, it's a 50-50 thing. I may bounce off the beam splitter or I may go through. However, if you knew that there was branch from the other side that's coming towards the beam splitter at the same time, you would make a completely different prediction. You would interfere and come out like the photon only one way. And that's what I'm trying to say now. So for you to be able to answer in one branch of your own world, which looks completely classical, you made a definitive observation, but to predict what's going to happen in the future requires you to know whether there will be interferences from other branches. So even the outcome you don't, so this is what quantum mechanics tells you. This is not a weird version of, this is exactly what quantum is all about. Even the outcome you don't see in your own experiment, namely the flip side of the experiment, the other outcome you think you ruled out, can affect you in the future if there is interference between these branches. It's as simple as that. So I don't know if this is clear, but that's all I'm trying to communicate at this stage.
Yeah, because in my opinion, what you said, maybe this is just game of words, but what you said, can you explain? So in quantum mechanics, your system don't have some, maybe not possibility, but don't have some value in your system before you measure it, yes?
Correct.
And
correct.
in your picture, it will be mean that you have all this value before you measure it. And it isn't that you go to the way that describe maybe hidden variable, but in quantity.
No, on the contrary. No, there are no hidden there. It's all based on non-commuting entities.
Yeah, but hidden variable in the similar to quantum way. Yeah? It's not classical.
Oh, I see what you mean. I'm thinking of non-commuting elements of reality as your hidden variables, if you want to call them like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I think you can say it like that. Again, it's maybe misleading because when people say hidden, they mean classical hidden variables. But if
this is the reason why
I like that way as well of what you just said. Quantum hidden variables. I like it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's great. So this summarizes, I think I can press on. This simply summarizes this experiment. Alice says, do you see a definitive state? Bob says in each branch, yes. He doesn't disclose what he sees because then Alice gets entangled. And if Alice gets entangled, we need another Alice outside to control the whole thing. So once you end up in an entangled state with something else, you cannot undo it from your own branch. That's also quantum mechanics. You can't get out of entanglement without someone else interfering it at a higher level. I mean, that's the whole point of interference, right? And okay, admittedly, extremely difficult. In fact, some people would say you are never going to be able to do something like this. It's always going to end up being noisy, irreversible. The same arguments as you might have against quantum computers. You will never do a large scale. I don't know. And I don't want to enter any speculations. We don't know. It's worth pushing and seeing how far we go. So this is the point I'm saying. It looks logically, this is a sound thought experiment. no contradictions, no inconsistencies. However, practically, depending on what it is that you're trying to interfere, ultimately, this could be extremely, extremely difficult. So even trying to undo what a single detector detects. If you have a photodetector, a photon goes in, creates an avalanche, an electrical current, at which point of this process, of this avalanche process, are you still able to undo things and reverse the click of the detector? I mean, already the fact that I'm calling it a click means that it entered your ear. So that means you would have to reverse even what you put. So you can see why this is difficult. But I'm saying even at the level of a detector, before it's made the click, but the photon is starting to do something, are you able to reverse that? So already this experiment would be a phenomenal one to try to explore, let alone doing this with a human perception. But here is the interesting bit now. So let's acknowledge thought experiment consistent, fully okay quantum mechanically. We don't know if it's like this. It's worth testing. But now, the interesting thing is that Alice can make this measurement to confirm that Bob really was in both of these branches. So in quantum information, you could call this a projection onto a Bell state. So Bob is simply a zero logical state of Bob's perception is correlated with the photon being in the state zero, and the one state, whichever way this is encoded by humans, I don't care, but it's probably a physical memory, is basically correlated with the state one of the photon. That's all this is. It's a single control NOT gate between a photon and the perception of Bob, or AI, or whatever else you want to use there. So now Alice can confirm that the state is entangled without collapsing it. You can project onto this state. It could be complicated, again, experimentally, but you can. And Alice can demonstrate to her. So Bob is happily thinking, oh, I see a definitive. Each of the branches contains Bob, who is happily thinking, oh, I see a definitive outcome. I'm happy about that. And indeed, he is happy in each of these branches. But Alice knows there's no contradiction between these two statements. That's the whole point of quantum mechanics. Alice knows that he exists in both of them simultaneously. And that's what disturbed Schrodinger originally. And later he thought about it. It took him about 20 years. And then he said, oh, this makes perfect. In fact, that's the only thing that makes sense if you think this way. Everything else doesn't make sense in quantum mechanics. That's how I feel now after a long time as well, thinking about this. So now here is another twist. She can now communicate to Bob. She can put another piece of paper underneath saying, Bob, I know how you feel. I know you feel you see a definitive outcome, but I just want to tell you that there is another Bob in the other branch simultaneously participating in this whole state. And I know it because I prepared this, I projected this state. So there's no contradiction. In each branch, Bob feels it's like a classical world, collapse of the wave function, everything is definitive. And yet, Alice outside says it's a huge entangled state. It's the beauty of quantum. No inconsistencies here. Whoever says this is inconsistent hasn't thought about it. There's no, of course, we haven't tested it. I don't know. Maybe one day we will realize this doesn't, human perception doesn't work like this. I don't know. But at the level of the pure theory, that's the argument I'm promoting here. There's no inconsistency. It's very interesting. It's just a very interesting picture. So this is this artist impression of what happens. Alice says, listen, I'm telling you, I know from your answer that you feel that you see a definitive state. And indeed, quantum mechanics predicts that in each branch, you definitely have recorded a definitive state. However, they're sitting together in a ginormous, in this case, superposition. That's it. And that's why I have this statement there that says unobserved, which means Bob in one branch who has not observed the other outcome, doesn't even know that the other branch exists. Only Alice knows that before he's told. That branch can in the future, if Alice is capable of interfering these two worlds, can affect the outcome in the first branch in which Bob exists. So that's really interesting. So this is the striking difference between classical and quantum logic. In classical logic, when you observe something, it's once and for all. Everyone agrees on that. You cannot now re-interfere another logical value with this first value and get yet another completely different answer. That's really the beauty of it. It's a strikingly beautiful and fascinating theory, actually. And if you are, this is almost like a popular way of accounting for what I'm saying. Because I thought about it, how do I explain to someone that you can know something, you can feel that you've seen an outcome, and yet confirm at the high level that the state is entangled without collapsing this at all from Alice's perspective. And actually, it's very similar to this riddle that you hear very frequently. This is one of those party questions that people talk about, or maybe sometimes even an interview question if you go for consultancy or banking job, that you have these two brothers standing in front of two doors, and one always tells the truth and the other one always lies. And one of these doors takes you to a happy place and the other one to a very sad place, a bit like Schrodinger's cat, if you like. In one branch you die, let's say, and the other one you live happily ever after. And you can ask only one yes/no question to one of the brothers to know with certainty ultimately which door is the good door to go through. And it's interesting that you can always get a correct answer without revealing ultimately, this is completely classical, this is a classical puzzle, but you get the answer to which door is the right door without knowing ultimately which of the brothers is a liar and which is the truth teller. Okay, and the solution, most of you know, is you ask one of them, what would your brother say if I asked him, if this door is whatever, goes to happy life? And you can now, it's a control, it's basically a parity check. Logically, this is a parity check. And entanglement, confirming entanglement, is exactly a parity check at the level of quantum gates. And I think that's what I'm going to proceed to show you. So basically, and this continues and so on. I don't want to go too much into this, because I want to show you how simple this is, logically speaking. That's the point that I'm making, that even though it sounds extremely complex, I've engaged very complex system here, but just to dramatize it in the same spirit as Schrodinger engaged a cat, to just say, it's preposterous to think that it could be dead and alive, that these both, two branches could exist. So for instance, here is a more realistic experiment where you couple a qubit to a complex enough, it has to be a quantum computer. A classical computer cannot do this, even if you claim that it's AGI or whatever people claim there. It cannot do it because it doesn't understand what it means to be in a superposition. It cannot be, by definition of being classical. However, if we had a quantum computer that even does some rudimentary observations, keeping a record, which is not difficult, actually. Like I said, our detectors almost already do that. You just have to make them quantum enough for long enough. Then you can repeat this experiment even with a quantum computer that may simulate something like that. Again, we don't really know how to do this, but I think it's certainly worth exploring. Ultimately, maybe this last point is an important one, because in addition to talking about measurement problem in quantum mechanics, which I'm arguing against, people also promote the idea that you need observers in quantum mechanics. And I don't think you need observers. Are not needed anywhere in physics. It's colorful to talk in terms, just like in relativity. We have an observer on the train station, another observer on the train, but this is how we communicate relativity to children in high school. This doesn't mean that you need an observer to do anything. Already nature implements relativity the way it unfolds. And in the same spirit, I'm saying nature just runs, if you like, whatever this means, quantum mechanics. It just does it. You don't need anyone to make any observation. They just take place. They're just natural interactions like any other physical interaction. So my guess is that consciousness certainly makes no difference to the logic I outlined. It may make a difference, as we discussed earlier, to the point that there is something extra needed for consciousness. And of course, I can't tell that because I don't know and no one else knows. But what I'm trying to say is that to describe this quantum mechanically, you don't need any extra ingredient. Everything is already physically taken care of. And let me show you the logically this before I go into a few other variants, which I think could be more realistic than what I discussed. So here is a network of 3 qubits. Qubit 1, state 0, qubit 2, state 0, and qubit 3, state 0 initially. Now, what you want to do, you can think of one of these qubits as being the photon in my story. The other qubit is Bob, and the third qubit is the piece of paper that Alice puts to confirm that Bob sees a definitive outcome. That's all you need, really. The circuit already implements what the role of Alice is simply to make sure that all the gates in the circuit have been implemented. So Alice doesn't need an extra qubit to simulate this. You can really think of Alice as sitting outside of all of this, and even you can think of Alice classically, because I'm not using any superpositions of Alice. I could. Even Alice is quantum mechanical, but for the purposes of these experiments, it's okay to think of Alice as being classically outside of this. It's not a mistake. It's a good approximation. That's what I'm saying. So here is Hadamard gate that puts the photon in a superposition of 2 states, 0 and 1. Here is a control NOT gate, which constitutes logically the observation that Bob makes. So when the photon is in the state 1, Bob's brain qubit, if you want to think about it, 1 qubit worth of Bob's brain that's required. So Bob can be very, very stupid. You don't need a smart a person at all for this experiment. 1 qubit is in the state 0 if the photon is in the state 0, and is in the state 1 when the photon is a maximally entangled Bell state, 0, 0, plus 1, 1. In each branch, Bob feels like, oh, here I definitely see 0 in this branch. And the other Bob is thinking, I definitely see a state 1. And here is the clever trick that Alice now does. In this case, it's simply, I call it a parity check. You do a control NOT between the first qubit, which is the photon state, and this third qubit, the piece of paper, if you like, in the experiment, and another control NOT between Bob's qubit worth of memory and the piece of paper. And this simply will come out in the state 0 if the two values here are the same. So because in the branch when both are 0, they will basically do nothing here. And in the branch where both are 1, they will also ultimately do nothing, because one will flip it and the other one will flip it back again, if you like. You will leave it in the, it's an eigenstate, in other words, of the parity operator, which is how you can confirm that something is entangled without collapsing it, by the way. That's the trick that I was making a big deal about, but actually it's 2 controlled NOT gates. And the Hadamard here is not even relevant. The Hadamard is here just to label the state 0 as a yes and the state 1 as a no, or vice versa. It's really your convention. You don't need it if you change the convention. And then the second, so up to this point, you're really in the experiment where Bob feels he's made a definitive observation and he's written it on the piece of paper. And now how does Alice confirm that this is really sitting beautifully in an entangled state? Well, she does exactly the opposite. Every interference experiment is simply applying U dagger, applying the inverse of the unitary transformation that you did in the first part of the experiment. And if you come back to the original state, then you've actually confirmed that your system interfered. So basically, you undo the controlled knot, which I call the observation, Bob observing the photon. You undo the superposition of the photon, and you are back to the state 0, 0, 0. That's it. The whole thing is a unitary transformation. And so it's amazing. Logically, you literally require 3 qubits to confirm that these two systems, the first 2 qubits, have perfectly observed each other. So needless to say, incidentally, another important point in quantum mechanics, observation is completely symmetric. I'm talking about Bob observing the photon, but in terms of qubits, photon has also perfectly observed the state of Bob's brain. There is in terms of entanglement, it's a completely symmetric property. Bob is entangled to the photon as much as the photon is entangled to Bob. It cannot be otherwise. That is, again, the crux of reversibility of quantum mechanics. So this is it. Anyone can implement this. Anyone I know with any decent small-scale quantum computer can actually do this experiment with qubits. And so now what I'm conjecturing and what I'm trying to promote is that we should take this into the macroscopic domain and really see whether this kind of logic persists. And so let me make a few comments about it. Twisted quantum logic. So the point I want to make now is that you will get into trouble if you analyze any of the things I've just said so far with classical logic. If at any point you apply the logic of classical observation, which is simply the logic that if I see something now, it means all other possibilities are non-existent. In classical physics, either you are 100% in one branch or 0% for something to happen. It's exactly deterministic in this way. Whereas in quantum mechanics, you've got these very interesting behaviors because of non-commuting observables and, of course, the resulting entangled states, which are part and parcel of this kind of stuff. So this is from a recent paper where we did a very similar experiment to the one I showed you with 3 qubits. And it illustrates where the classical logic goes wrong in a similar structure. I'm showing you this Penrose triangle because it's one of those impossible structures where what you're trying to say is that down each of these sides of the triangle, there is an agreement. So, you know, these 2 vertices agree with one another down this side. And then the vertex 2 agrees with the vertex 3, logically speaking, down this side. And the vertex 3 connects back to vertex 1 and agrees. However, taken together, they cannot all agree at the same time. And that's at the root of every apparent supposed quantum paradox is a logic of this kind. It's just simply, what it simply means is that you are inappropriately using the laws of Boolean logic to argue for something that doesn't obey the laws of Boolean logic. The unobserved things can affect you in the future. That's the bit that you don't have in classical Boolean logic. And I don't want to, again, bore you. I just want to show you I can talk more if you're interested, but this was the group of Marco Genovese in Turin. They did a very simple variant of 2 qubits starting in a state 0, then making a superposition of the first qubit, then a controlled Hadamard to entangle the first and the second qubit. And then there was a sequence of reasonings here which resembles very much a classical logic. So there was a measurement at the point 2, if you like, labeled here, the green cloud, based on the outcome of this measurement, you were concluding that the other qubit must be in some state. And then based on the qubit of this, on the state of the second qubit, you went back to the first qubit and concluded that the state of the first qubit must be yet another state which is in perfect contradiction, which is what this red arrow shows you, in perfect contradiction with the first conclusion that you have. And of course, this is always a consequence of the non-commuting entities. So if you made a measurement at the point 2 in the Z basis, in the 0-1 basis, but prior to that, you made a Hadamard gate, which rotates the basis from Z to X and from X to Z, then you can no longer use the outcome at the point 2 to conclude anything about what happened prior to doing that gate. So it's a bit like, I have a probably far simpler way of illustrating this. This one, I think it was an experiment which does this with a higher fidelity. But let me give you a very simple redux version. Imagine a state 0, 0 plus 1, 1, as we had earlier. And imagine that Alice makes the first qubit and says, oh, I've got 0 now. But Bob chooses to measure the second qubit in the plus minus basis. And let's say Bob gets the state plus. So now Alice is thinking, I've got a state 0. I was maximally entangled with Bob. Bob must have 0, must have the state 0. That's what classical logic tells you. But Bob has decided to do a measurement in a complementary basis. He cannot get the state 0. He gets a state 0 plus 1. But Bob now, because he is also using entanglement to make logical inferences or correlations, if you like. It's enough to be correlated. Bob says, oh, but I got plus outcome on my side and I was entangled with Alice. It must be that Alice has the state plus as well. No, she doesn't. She just made a measurement and she has a state 0. So you can see that if you have entangled states, and this is a general property of superpositions, that following through classical logic, through measurements that are separated by these non-commuting entities, simply won't do the job. And I challenge you to find a single paradox that people talk about as a paradox in quantum mechanics that is not just a simple consequence of this. Anything, Kochen-Spehe, Gleason, Bell, contextuality, you name it, are all a consequence of this simple fact. So whoever claims that something goes wrong in quantum mechanics, this is my statement, and it's a strong statement, but I think it's true. I wouldn't be saying it otherwise, is that whoever concludes that there is something problematic with quantum mechanics has simply used classical logic to infer things that are not classical. Of course, you will reach a paradox. Anyway, like I said, there are many people who agree with me too, but only the future tests can show this. It's a dead simple experiment. So this one is even simpler than the Deutsch experiment that I showed you, in that it requires only 2 qubits, not even 3 qubits. And this is what Marco's group did. So ultimately, just one small point on this logic, and this is all well known. I want to give you a flavor of that, and then I will discuss briefly the experiments that I have in mind that I think would be very exciting to go in that direction at the interface of certainly of possibly even neuroscience and quantum physics. So what fails in quantum logic, if you want to really speak in terms of logic, formally defined mathematical logic, and I think this was clear to von Neumann maybe first and foremost, but more or less anyone else who's worked on quantum logic ultimately, is that what fails formally is what we call the law of distribution. If you think of quantum measurements as propositions, so, is my system in the state 0 or the state 1 is like a logical equivalent of the truth statement, where you either get something to be true or false, 0 and 1. But of course, quantumly, you can ask this in infinitely many complementary ways. And that's exactly why classical logic fails. But if you think of projections as propositions, if you like, then what fails is the distribution which says that proposition A or proposition B and another proposition C are simply not, it's not a distributive logic, are simply not equal to A and C or B and C. So that's really what happens. And I think it suffices in my picture to simply think of horizontal and vertical. These are just simply 0 and 1 states. I'm thinking of a photon polarized either horizontally or vertically. It's probably one of the easiest qubits to capture. And the red arrow is simply an equal superposition of the horizontal and vertical. And if you label A and B as vertical and horizontal and C is your 45, you will simply see that one side of this inequality is always true. It gives you always a true value because you're always going to pass either V or H or 45. One of them is going to work in your experiment. However, when you go to the right-hand side, you can never pass vertical and 45. This is A and C, and you can never pass B and C, horizontal and 45. So they are quantum mechanically identically equal to 0, and 0 or 0 is logically 0, whereas the left-hand side is in fact always true, because if you put a polarizer at 45, or you choose to put it vertically and horizontally, something will pass through this one. So it's interesting that formally you can even argue that this is a variant of logic, which, unlike classical logic, fails the law of distribution, and that's basically all there is to it in a sense. So let me tell you. I don't want to bore you with this is an experiment I wanted to show you that we have been working on for a while, and we have some funding to entangle two living systems. So I wanted to show you realistically how far people think they can go with superposing parts of living systems and so on. And it's very difficult. Already the experiment that I'm showing you here, which is to trap two, let's say, bacteria, even forget about cats and humans, to trap two bacteria, living bacteria, in optical cavities and entangle them through a single photon. So this will be the Schrödinger cat experiment, but applied to the simplest living system, if you like, that we can think of. Already this is extremely challenging. And there is a question, of course, how to execute it. Again, I don't doubt at all that this is doable, and that you will entangle the two systems by simply having the photon being absorbed by one and not the other, and vice versa. And then, of course, you have to even confirm that it's entangled. So it's a very complex experiment. This would be a hugely intricate thing to do. But it seems to me logically, again, it is rather simple. And it's difficult to see that anything will fundamentally fail in this experiment. Of course, controlling all the things, making sure the noise is controlled or reduced enough and so on, are practical issues. But I'm arguing that fundamentally nothing probably stands in our way. However, now I want to conclude by some of these crazier things, maybe. And I want to say, what about really going in the direction of conscious observers? What about really, again, I don't think humans are the only conscious animals. It would be difficult to imagine that apes are not conscious. And as you go down the evolutionary scale, probably, I don't even know where I would stop as far as consciousness is concerned. Maybe a spider is not conscious. I have no idea, really. But that's the whole point, to test some of these things and to ask yourself, how does it behave, and does any of this behavior require us to modify our understanding of the laws of physics? That's basically what a physicist really cares about. So, for instance, testing lots of tests already on the sensitivity of the human, not just the human eye, but in this case, human eye, to the intensity of light. So I think we have a threshold of about 4 or 5 photons that we need to detect. Of course, statistically, you could detect less than that, but it's not going to be a faithful detection. So you need, if you want faithful detection, you need more than a certain basic average number of photons, which goes slightly above the thermal noise inside our optical system. So nature has evolved us exactly to be able to discriminate thermal noise of our receptors, if you like, from the signal. That's why it sits at about 4 or 5 photons. I don't remember this. But what people haven't tested much is the sensitivity, for instance, to the polarization of light. And then, more interesting than that, is what about entangled photons? What if you shown a pair of entangled photons, which are very simple to generate, as you know? The whole of optical quantum computing is effectively based on entangled photons. What about the detection of entangled photons? Can the statistics that's inferred from the human perception, can it really tell us that these states are entangled? Can we witness that? Or would our eyes simply confuse this with the statistical correlations of classically correlated photons? That one is horizontal, the other one is horizontal, or not at the same time, vice versa. So we don't know. But to me, this is a hugely, why is no one doing something like this? That sounds like a very interesting idea. Can we tell the different states of light that are coming into our eyes? And of course, eyes are like the interface of, you can almost say that eyes are part of the brain. It's the kind of periphery which is crucial for what follows then. Now, we have had experiments, that's the second point that I'm mentioning, where people are trying to violate Bell's inequalities. I think Gizan has done something like that a while back. They're trying to detect entangled states between photons by using humans instead of detectors, who are sitting there instead of detectors, and they're just reporting whether they see a flash of light or not. And you can introduce all of the polarization needed to rotate the basis for Bell measurements before that. So, of course, you don't expect that the human observer does that, although, as I said in the first question, we don't know. We really don't understand how much there is a sensitivity and dependence on the polarization. But what Gizan managed to do is really to use, I think he used his students. His PhD students were the detectors, and indeed, when they reported seeing something, when you collect the statistics, you can actually put it together to violate Bell's inequalities. So again, to someone like me, this is not a surprise. Maybe the surprise is that human eyes are sensitive enough to do that. But certainly it's not a surprise from the conceptual point of view. I don't think anyone expects anything different with humans. We are surely at least good enough detectors of some of these things as our artificially made detectors. So no one expects. However, it's an interesting thing to test as a physicist, simply because you're asking, is there something more? Does something go wrong in this case? And, many people would argue that something goes wrong, as I said. But to someone with my bias, it's clear that you should get the same result as with photodetectors. Now even more ambitious. And I think this to me would be the first, if I was an experimentalist and I had that kind of prowess, I would be doing exactly this. So we know that if you have two excited systems, people have done this with almost anything. In fact, the ultimate violations of Bell's inequalities, closing the locality loophole with nanodiamonds, did exactly this, but not with humans. So I'm asking, can you repeat this with human perception instead of detectors? So basically, let me describe the experiment. You have two excited systems, and now a photon gets emitted. And usually you impinge this photon on a beam splitter because you want to confuse the two possibilities for the system 1 to emit or the system 2 to emit. If you knew which system emitted the photon, the state wouldn't be entangled. One would be excited and the other one would be consequently in the ground state. However, if you mix these two at the beam splitter and you get a clicking in the output port, one of the two output ports, you will actually have an entangled state of the two emitting system. One will be excited and the other one ground, and vice versa in a coherent superposition. So like I said, this has been done with many different systems. And in fact, what we'd like to do with bacteria, this is one possible route how to entangle them, to first excite them and then confuse the emission. Confused with the beam splitter in a superposed way. Now, imagine that you don't detect this photon, but you put a human observer. This to me just sounds fascinating. I mean, it's just a fun thing. Again, I don't expect anything to go wrong here. I'm betting all of my money on the outcome, on the positive outcome in this case. But what I would like to see is that the human reporting detection of the photon thereby projects the state of the two emitting systems into an entangled state. Wouldn't that be cool to say I entangle two atoms just by looking? And it sounds super cool. Again, it sounds super cool if you're not initiated in quantum, or obviously if you've already accepted quantum mechanics as I have, this is just a normal experiment, you know, nothing surprising. But still, I think it's worth testing it. And obviously, as always, when we venture into something new, we may get surprised. We don't know. Now, here is a variant of this. Now I'm ramping it up. I'm making it more and more. And I'm really hoping that sooner or later, someone on the neuroscience side also gets excited and they can maybe even monitor the brain as we execute some of these experiments. Sounds a bit like science fiction, but like I'm saying, to me, all of this is still much, much, much easier than Schrodinger's cat, the full experiment as I outlined with the human. Because once you trigger the human perception, the system becomes extremely delocalized. The information spreads everywhere. You get decoherence everywhere, left, right, and center. You can't control it. And therefore, it seems to me that this, of course, will always be a difficult experiment. I'm not saying impossible. We don't know how this will continue. And maybe we can control a small enough part of our brain to be able to do this. Maybe Musk can give us a good chip to implant, which we can control. I have no idea. Who's to say? You know, technological progress is amazing. But all of this seems to me much, much more complex than the stuff I'm outlining now. And even what I'm outlining, I think it's complicated in its own right, but exciting. I'd jump on it. If I was a PhD student now, I'd be doing exactly this kind of stuff. Can a human execute a Bell state measurement? So now, not just detecting one photon, but detecting entangled photons with a knock-on effect that you teleported the state of the photon into yet another receptor. In this case, another human, if you like. Let's go all out with humans or AIs, whatever you like to experiment with. So basically, there is an entangled pair. You have an extra qubit that comes in. My observation now serves to get a signal from one of the two entangled qubits and the qubit to be teleported, based on which I've actually executed a Bell state measurement. I communicate that to the other person, upon which they've actually received the teleported version of the first qubit. Again, mathematically, this works, or logically, if you like, this works perfectly well. There's no reason why this ought not to be possible. It just sounds fantastic to me. You know, I've teleported something to you. You can see why this sounds like science fiction. I've teleported something to you simply by looking at it. And you can see how all sorts of crazy people and pseudoscientists might get excited by this. But what I'm saying is pure quantum physics. There's no speculation here going beyond quantum. The only speculation is this too complicated to be practically executed in the near future. That's the only thing that I see here. But no speculation, nothing else is required other than the good old standard laws of quantum mechanics. Okay. Now let's go science fiction even more, and I think this is why all of this is just to illustrate to you how many beautiful possibilities there are when you venture and you take quantum mechanics from the simple atomic and molecular domain in which it's been sitting for the last 100 years, and you take it out into the macroscopic domain. You take it outside even of many body solid state physics into chemistry, and from chemistry into biology, and this may or may not include consciousness and everything else. In fact, there's no reason to think that it will not one day include all of that once we understand it properly. So can we now even play between these conscious and subconscious detection? Because of course, there are many things happening in our brain that play the role of definitive outcomes in the sense that they are registered, but they may be registered in a subconscious way. So again, you know, going back to this Deutsch version of the Schrödinger cat experiment, and having Alice and Bob there, having different observers. So could it be somehow that someone knows at a higher level, someone like Alice, knows that you were actually made a definitive observation, while Bob himself still has this observation only stored in a subconscious part? So you know, this kind of experiment would require us really to understand the dynamics. First of all, what it means to remain subconscious. Why do some things reside mainly? In fact, most things reside at the subconscious level, as you know. And then how does that interface go with the conscious part? Where does consciousness get informed that something has already happened in the subconscious? Any game you can play at the classical level, this is what this statement is really meant to say. You can play even more interestingly with the quantum logic. You can simply engage superpositions and entanglements at that level. And then you get these interesting things that you may have this entangled state, you may have definitive observations in each branch, but the person involved may not be consciously aware of that. It has happened, but they don't know it's happened. So actually the way you learn that it's happened is at the higher level, where Alice has done this Bell state projection and told you that something has actually happened already at the subconscious level. So there are so many interesting twists and turns. I mean, you know, once you start thinking about these things, you can develop this, you can riff on this in your own time. But of course, ultimately, it's always a question of just complexity. It's a question of, do we have a handle on any of this? Can we control it to the degree that it's required for quantum effects? Already the stuff that I'm mentioning on this slide is something that I think even neuroscience at the classical level has not really probed or understood well enough. So I don't know whether that first needs to take place before we can even discuss these things. We don't know, but it's interesting, and it's nice to stimulate development in this way, to use the technologies that are developed by physicists to apply them then to more and more complex systems. And then, you know, a slide that I'm just referring to some other speculations. In this case, it's Matthew Fisher, who actually came up with a surprising paper. I want to say that maybe what I was saying previously about having a superposition of two different outcomes, if you like, and observations is not possibly so crazy. And for instance, Matthew Fisher outlined a molecule which exists obviously inside the brain at high temperature, room temperature. I mean, high for quantum effects, warm and wet, as people informally say. And I think Matthew Fisher identified a spin state within this complex molecule that he claims. I don't know if this has ever been actually subjected to experiments, whether this has ever been verified or even what is the upper bound. But his claim from a very simple theoretical model is that these spins can last in a superposition of states up to 24 hours. And so this is very interesting. When you say this to someone, here is a very complex molecule inside a living system, not just a living system, but one of the most complex systems we're aware of, human brain. And I'm claiming that there is a kind of decoherence-free subspace, and these spins can exist in a superposition over long periods. Then immediately what you're saying to a physicist, of course, is first, is this credible? Secondly, how do we show that? And thirdly, then can we use this to do some of these more interesting experiments? So I'm kind of course, joking here that I call these things photons, you know, of the analog of photons, single particles of light. I'm now using a quantum terminology to describe thoughts. I'm not at all suggesting that this is how this logic works. Who knows? We don't know, but it's certainly something interesting to explore. And to a physicist, it would be very interesting to find out whether really the conventional laws of physics do capture everything out there. I think they do. That's where my bias comes in. I don't see a reason why physics will not be able to understand this one day. I'm not saying with the current physics, maybe not, but certainly there's no reason to stop researching in this interesting direction. So let me just summarize it briefly, and I'm very happy to continue. There's a lot more to be said in this direction. So the main point that I'm making is that it's perfectly consistent to think of quantum mechanics as being able to be applied to everything so far. Even the whole universe could be thought, whether this is like this or not is a question for experiments, for future experiments. But theoretically speaking, you will never get into a logical inconsistency so long as you apply quantum mechanics consistently. If you revert back to classical logic, you will always find something inconsistent. That's the flip side of the statement I'm making. Now, it's not even as a consequence of this very simple statement. Everything is entangled. It's not a question of, is there entanglement out there? In fact, every interaction, more or less, other than some very special interactions, will result in entanglement. But the question is, can you contain this entanglement within a domain which you can control, subject to experiments that last long enough that you can confirm this? And the reason, again, is that entanglement just simply spreads through everything, through this interaction. And once things have decohered outside of the domain which you can control, then, as we said, for all practical purposes, things behave in a commutative way. They just are simply classical. They follow the rules of classical logic. So even though the whole universe doesn't, a small enough subspace will ultimately become classical enough if it's entangled enough. So the question is, how do we do this intelligently? So it's not a question for me, is it out there? I think it's out there, and that's the only thing that's out there in quantum. It's all entangled. However, can we control this in a particular subsystem, and can we get something interesting is a completely different question. And there are many practical obstacles all of us can see to this. So that's basically my point number three, that even when you don't see quantum effects, the reason why you don't see them is because of quantum effects at a higher level. So in fact, even classical world exists because the whole universe is quantum mechanical. And that follows from these experiments. Bob, who never communicates with Alice and can never subject himself to a bigger level interference experiment, for all practical purposes just exists in one branch. Bob can never hop into the other branch. We know that's impossible quantum mechanically. It requires an outside experimentalist to control the two branches and interfere them. But within each of these branches, Bob is as good as classical as far as this experiment is concerned. That's why we can get away with the language of collapse, because it's very unlikely that unless someone controls us and our brain and everything we observe, it's unlikely that you will ever interfere with any of the other outcomes that you didn't observe. It's just unlikely. It's a question of being unlikely, not impossible. That's the point here. So this requires careful engineering, but it can be done, and you can get a completely consistent outcome to that. And so then the final point I'm making, that even if you ignore all of these debates about the meaning of this, what is quantum mechanics telling us at this high level, it's always interesting to a physicist to really push these boundaries and ask whether even rudimentary quantum effects can be seen in more complex systems. To us physicists, this is a question that's worth asking, even if it's not related to biological functionality, even if our perception doesn't particularly rely on this kind of aspect of quantum mechanics, it's still worth to a physicist, maybe not to a psychologist or biologist, but to a physicist, it's worth asking, is it like that in this macroscopic domain? Can we really confirm that? And that's, of course, what physics is all about. You push your theory, you take it seriously, you extrapolate it, and sooner or later, just like it happened with classical physics, you may really get a contradiction. You may get something different experimentally speaking, not a logical contradiction, but an experimental one, in which case, of course, it's very exciting for all of us. So I'm going to finish my talk here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to engage in any discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. And on the chat, there was a few questions. The first question was from Julia. Julia, if you want, you can ask for yourself.
Of course.
Vlatko, hello.
Hi.
Hi, let me take my little privacy thing off.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Beautiful talk. I think you remember
Thank
me
you.
from the Quantum Time Machine meeting in
Of course.
2022. Yes.
Of course.
So I have two questions for you. And I think, and I'm going to use words as usual that may not match with how you think about things because of my background as a neuroscientist.
Of course.
So first of all, I guess last first, what do you think about the idea that the subconscious, or let's just call them generally the non-conscious processes of the brain, are there to manage all the potential superpositions, and the purpose of the conscious mind is to just choose one world? What do you think about that?
It's a great question. Actually, you know what impressed me? It's a great question, and in fact, it's extremely relevant to exactly what I was suggesting at some point. This exists. The first time I saw it, I think, is in the book by David Bohm.
Yes.
David Bohm, again, he may have believed in some kind of classical hidden reality and all of that, and the philosophy there may be completely different. But I think he has a whole section in his book exactly talking about, but I think he means it more metaphorically.
Yeah.
And I guess 70 years ago, you would really think of this as just a metaphor, but I think you are suggesting it as a real possibility. So I think when talking about superpositions, he almost links this to this dreamlike state of exactly of processing of information inside the brain before you've made the decision, as you say, maybe before the conscious part has become aware of it. And it could really be that for short enough time scales, like I said, so long as decoherence allows this and it's maybe not too delocalized and so on, I think it's not crazy to entertain this idea that maybe a subconscious part really does exploit quantum mechanics, at least to some degree. I mean, it doesn't have to be all quantum mechanical. It probably is not a universal quantum computer and things like that, because we know that this would really be surprising and it would require, a huge entangled states over a long period of time. But certainly it could be made of small interference steps, which are then collected together into a conscious. To me, this would be. I have no idea how to even begin to ask questions experimentally in this direction. But I think it's a great point that you made. It is possible. It certainly should be investigated.
I don't know how to experiment with it either. Atmanspacher maybe does something like it, but
Yes.
but I don't even know if that's what he's doing. Okay,
No.
so that's good to hear that you don't think that's nuts. And then the other
No.
thing is this idea of I want to call it super entanglement, but what you're talking about is considering entanglement all the way through every level. Considering quantum mechanics all the way through every level. Does that help us understand causally ambiguous effects like inhibited spontaneous emission?
That is, you see, spontaneous. If I understood correctly, you're talking because in quantum mechanics, the way we talk about these spontaneous emissions, there's just maybe a side remark, and it may be missing the point of what you're asking, but spontaneous it comes from the time before we had the full quantum theory. By the way, this itself is a very interesting topic of discussion and investigation, because if you really quantize everything, if you quantize the electromagnetic field as I'm advocating and saying really everything in your picture ought to be ultimately upgraded to quantum mechanics, then there isn't anything spontaneous, interestingly enough. It's spontaneous maybe relative to ignoring certain aspects of the environment, but if you include the vacuum of the electromagnetic field, actually spontaneous emission becomes a stimulated emission. It's wrong jargon. The jargon is wrong simply because it came before quantum mechanics, if you like. And it's stimulated by the vacuum. But I should say that even here there are heated debates about whether what I'm saying is true and how much this has been confirmed and so on. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, but that's an interesting point. It has implications for atomic clocks, right? So that's very interesting. But the question was more about an inhibited spontaneous, what we call inhibited spontaneous emission.
Inhibited, yeah, that you really block certain.
But based on the future availability of an absorber, right, a photon is or is not emitted. This kind of causal confusion or causal ambiguity, I'm always trying to find a way of thinking about quantum mechanics that better explains that.
To me, I understood the question now, and I think I might be wrong, but to me, it always helps to really think about everything quantum mechanically. It really does clarify, because as soon as you introduce a cut, which is sometimes called the Heisenberg cut, that you say this side is quantum, the other side is classical, you almost invariably have to violate something.
Right.
Simply because the classical side doesn't understand the quantum, it just doesn't have the information capacity of the quantum side.
So the way that in what we call inhibited spontaneous emission, the way that it would be explained in this line of thinking would then be, look, we don't worry about the fact that this thing is in the so-called future because there is no privilege now. And so we take the whole system, past, present, and future as unitary. Is that right?
That's it. That's it. That's what I would advocate. To me, certainly, I know it's confusing if you haven't thought about these things this way. And certainly when we teach quantum mechanics, we do not teach it this way at all. We actually emphasize the observers and the projections and collapses and so on, which in my view is actually completely wrong. That's not how nature is at all.
I agree. Yeah,
but it's interesting. Problem. It's very interesting.
It shapes the brains differently. So, anyway, thank you, Vodka. That was great.
Yeah, no, it's all pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question was mine. That because I'm more theoretical physicist, so natural question is how and what will change if you change quantum mechanics to quantum field theory, because quantum mechanics is not basis of these kinds of theory, and what happens to the entanglement in the case of other kinds of interaction, not only electrodynamic, and for example, as you do weak force or
excellent.
Environment, and of course other. I mean, for example, for gravity, how it's
excellent. all of these questions are beautiful questions. Actually, again, someone with my bias, so field theory, of course, it's very important that you mention it, and it plays a crucial role in, just as it did for classical field theory, in taking into account locality. So that's why I kind of responded aggressively, so to speak, when I heard non-locality, because one ought to say Bell non-locality. That's a different. What Bell had in mind is to say that if you stick to classical hidden variables, then the only way you can explain entanglement is to allow non-local effects. But remember the premise: if you believe in hidden variables, they must be non-local. That's logical. I agree with that statement. But to say that quantum mechanics is non-local as a result, no, only Bell non-local. In fact, the word that some people use is that it's Einstein local. So Einstein locality is exactly the field theory, the Faraday locality or Maxwell locality, whatever name you want to use there. And actually, if you, as you suggested yourself as well, if you believe that the hidden elements of reality are quantum are non-commuting entities, are Q numbers, as Dirac called them, then quantum mechanics is as local as any classical field theory. And that's the whole point. That's why we go in that direction, because we are thinking the easiest way to keep having this locality, which we all think holds. I don't think anyone thinks that relativity is really violated. It's been tested as well as anything else. The only way to do that is to maintain this wave-like structure, but to upgrade the amplitude, if you like, and the phase of the wave into quantum. That's how Dirac quantized the electromagnetic field. Your point is very beautiful now, because we are confident, obviously, in the state. In the case of light, we are very people can do detailed state tomography, can actually capture more or less any superposition within a certain, reasonable small number of photons and so on. So we are confident that the electromagnetic field really is quantum, the way that anything else is quantum. But other fields have not been tested. And so again, someone like me may say, well, of course they're going to be quantum, but in fact we have very little evidence, and I'm only familiar, only because I interacted with these people. I'm familiar with some high energy physicists from Oxford who are going in the direction of trying to think about Bell inequality violation, but within experiments in high energy physics. So that's actually what you're asking. You're saying the strong force, the weak force, and gravity, even more interestingly, will it obey the same rules? And I think we are, of course, I was going to say we are certainly experimentally, we are much less confident. In fact, we have no evidence that this is like this, no direct evidence, let's put it that way. No one has directly violated Bell's inequalities with these things. But it seems to me these are really worth asking. And after all, quantum field theory, by combining quantum physics with special relativity, or ultimately even general, if you want to go in that direction, is a different kind of theory from just the ordinary quantum mechanics, simply because you're not imposing the same causal structure on non-relativistic quantum mechanics. And we know that it's fraught with all sorts of extra difficulties as a result. So to me, these are very interesting things to test. It hasn't been tested at all. And I hope that, again, what I see as the main obstacle is simply the complexity of these experiments. They're not as straightforward as the atomic physics experiments, where we have huge control of our quantum degrees of freedom. But I think it's worth doing it because simply we don't know. It could be that these other fields function differently. There are all sorts of interesting proposals in that direction, arguing that gravity will never be quantized, or it doesn't even need to be quantized, in fact. And these proposals are suggesting some kind of semi-classical descriptions where the space-time always remains a classical field and somehow quantum fields are sitting on top of it. So I think this is possible to test, and I'm really excited about these things. But I'm just saying how far some of these speculations go, that it's simply wide open. And I agree with you that one direction is going into chemistry, biology, maybe perception, whatever else, consciousness. But certainly there is a lot of mileage to be gained by testing other fundamental theories in physics, not just going into chemistry and higher complexity. I think it's a very important point.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before next question, just one remark that we must remember that when we build a bridge, we don't use even relativistic
Of course.
physics. We use just Newton physics. So maybe you, for your kinds of thinking, we need of course new kinds of experiment and new kind of thinking about it. But of course, I think that this direction is very, very nice. Okay, so can we, because I don't see any new question on the
question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
I'll try to be very brief. I'm assuming that from cosmology, from Big Bang, everything is entangled to some extent. So there is some entangle between objects, physical objects. And
Yes.
In terms of objects, biological, they're also objects. So there's entanglement. So my question is about information. So if objects can be regarded as information and biological being as information, so can we entangle information? Say, for instance, a digital person entangled to a biological person. That's my question.
Both of your points are excellent. In fact, I very frequently think about them because, as you say, if you really think that the whole universe is somehow a closed quantum system, then it's very natural that these entanglements are already developing from the early universe. Whatever is the origin of our universe, you know that cosmologists and astrophysicists change their mind every 5 years or so, right? So there is this, there isn't this, and so on. So I can't comment on that because I think, again, it's very exciting, and we will probably have some very profound changes of how we view the early universe there. However, if it's true that quantum mechanics played a role of that kind, then I agree with you that even the observations that we are making now could in principle reflect some of these early quantum mechanical behavior. So sometimes I'm thinking, gravity may be difficult to test in the lab, whether it's quantum mechanical, but do we have enough evidence? And what would it mean to have enough evidence that some of these quantum gravitational effects were important in the early universe? And there are some beautifully written speculations and papers on this. So that would be even easier, that if nature did these things for us for free, if you like, and we don't have to struggle and work very hard to get this data. That's an excellent point. The second point you made is a very different question, very valid as well, and I'm curious about it as well, because I frequently like to say that gaining information is, just like in the experiment I showed, is simply creating entanglement between two or more systems, as many systems as you want them to be involved in these transactions. But what you are saying is let's subject this to an experiment as well, because how do we know that that simply a digital system that's clearly capable of recording an event, you can absorb a photon, this can trigger some response, you can encode it in the memory of your computer, there's no problem with that. What happens now if you couple that kind of system to a system like ourselves, for instance? Are we talking about the same kind of information processing? Is there something more to making an observation in the I was going to say in the case of humans, but actually you can ask this for any living system. Maybe already living systems are different kind of information processing to digital systems. These are all beautiful. I have no idea, of course. I have no answer there. I think they're definitely worth undertaking. One thing I should say is that at present, that would be my again simple bias, and I will put it in a cautious way, if you like, scientifically, is that I think, to the best of my knowledge, we have no evidence that our information processing is any different to the digital one. Of course, if you allow the digital, for instance, to have the quantum effects, and you really try to mirror everything, then it seems to me so far we can account for everything in this way. But it is an open question. It certainly is a hypothesis, as you say, that these two information processing methods are one and the same. Can they really couple to one another? Are they compatible? Do they have the same capacity? I have no idea, but nothing tells me otherwise at this stage. That's kind of the statement I would like to make.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good answer.
Thank you.
Okay, before next question, my one remarks, because classical physicists told us that entanglement doesn't exist, and you told us that everything is entangled. So
Yes.
my quantum logics tell me that it is important if everything is entanglement or not entanglement, because I can easily find systems that are not entanglement and
Yes.
are entanglement. So maybe this could be resolved.
Yes, I think you're right that I always mean classical in this approximate way, that in a sense classical means you won't make a mistake if you just simply treat it classically. You won't make a mistake as far as the experiment that you are telling me goes, but it doesn't mean that you cannot conceive of an experiment that's going to invalidate this kind of classical picture. So it's still classical only within an envelope of quantum mechanics. That's usually how. So it's kind of classical for all practical purposes as far as your practice goes. But in principle, and I think this is what many people frequently don't realize, in principle, whenever you call something classical and you are coupling it to a quantum system, you could in principle test whether that thing that you call classical is ultimately really quantum. And that's the interesting thing. There's no need to keep calling certain things classical.
Yeah, thank you very much. But
Thanks.
I feel that you're feeling my thinking. So next question, Terry, do you have questions? So if you can. We don't hear you, Terry. If you
No, I can't.
I can't get the video to start. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, now, yes, definitely. Hi.
I'm really just a general comment especially from my readings of Feynman. He really emphasized that in the issue of entanglement of photons or any particles, neutron is the specific example I gave in the commentary. Once you get an information signal latched on to a single atom, that's it. So you don't get any further interference effect. Effectively, that single atom,
that's it.
Observer from that point on is
that's it.
Describes it. So when I saw the picture from that one very interesting looking article, I want to look at that more closely. My immediate reaction was that no, that's just not going to interfere, because you've gone through biological molecules that are changing state, and
Yes.
thus they are simply detecting. They're one or the other. We'll get it.
Yes.
And the broader context then would not come into play. Now keep in mind, I should emphasize I am a heretic of the nth order. I believe that atoms are observers. And this is very different.
Me too.
Oh, okay.
Me too, absolutely. So that's the point. That's why I emphasize the 3 qubits are sufficient to, but I'm on the side that nothing, so if by atoms being observers, you are trying to imply that they're conscious, I'm at the other extreme. I think nothing is conscious, actually.
No,
Even
we're in full agreement on that one.
that's it.
Don't want to go there. In fact, I think it's
how would they call it panpsychism, and I would be something like apsychism, whatever is the negation of panpsychism, right? So
I'm a momentumism because when you change momentum, you change the relativistic frame of both objects.
yes,
You create a momentum pair, both of them now know where the other is. How is that?
yes, that's it. Yes, you're absolutely right. So to destroy quantum effects, exactly as you said, it's enough to have a single qubit. If you're talking about a qubit of interference, qubit worth of interference, it's enough to have another qubit that entangles, and then you don't use it anymore in future experiments. That's it. You're as good as classical. And that's it. That's exactly right. In that sense, you can call that other qubit an observer, but you can interchange the role of the two qubits, and you can call the first qubit as an observer of the second. It's completely fine. I think that's all that's required. I agree.
Okay.
It's an excellent, it's a different way. It's a slightly different way of talking about decoherence, but I think your reference to Feynman, I think he talks very, very clearly about that.
It's a nice little section. And the fact that he bases it so heavily on very real experiments on
Yes.
on the
Yes. Yes,
Make
beautiful discussions. And all I'm doing is I'm extrapolating it by saying, however, if you do control these extra degrees of freedom that happen to get entangled, then you can do a higher level interference experiment, and you won't find any contradiction in that. Now, obviously, as you say, if the molecules are really too complicated, if the information has spread, entanglement has spread throughout, if you have thermal noise, whatever else is there, you will, of course, find it exceedingly difficult to actually do anything coherently. And that may be ultimately what kills some of these ideas.
If I could ask a different one, the other note that I put in there about, oh shoot, now I have to go back and
yes.
I'm sorry, I lost my own note. Just go ahead and go on with somebody else.
Don't worry, don't worry.
So if I can, just one remarks that I think that it is not atom observer, but any kinds of interaction between the systems are observers, because if you say that atom is observers or observation, it means that there has no sense, there's no make sense free system. Yes.
Yes, any system that has two orthogonal states, and that it's capable of being in a superposition of these, in fact constitutes a good so that's why I don't like the word observer, because it carries all sorts of other implications. And as soon as you say observer, people think, oh, how much capacity does it need to have? Does it need to be intelligent and whatever else? None of that's relevant. That's why I actually say that there is no measurement problem. There is no need for observers. I'm not denying that there are entities like us that are capable of doing something, but you don't need to do anything special to describe that, as far as we know, so far as we know.
If I could check back in real quick, just to clarify, and also for my own reputation, not consciousness, information deposition. And yes. I think that is so much simpler and so much more experimentally solid. And this is why I like the Feynman example.
I agree.
He didn't say the crystal was conscious. He didn't say
no need. That's it.
What he said was that you left a signal. You left information. And I think
that's exactly right.
So much easier to talk about it that way.
I fully agree. You don't need any other kind of metaphysical language. Fully agree. Yes, that's it. That's it. Have you simply imprinted information in this other system to which you either won't have access or you don't want to have access, or for whatever reason you're not going to use in the future interference experiments, and that's it. So basically, for two slates, as you know, obviously, as he speaks in the lectures as well, Feynman, is that you just need somehow some information about which of the two slits this goes. And it could be for whatever reason. You could polarize the two differently. If it's horizontal, it goes through one slit. If it's vertical, the other slit already kills the interference unless you rotate the polarizations and you erase this information, which would be kind of Wheeler's delayed choice version of this. So of course, before you recombine the two, you could flip back one of the polarizations so that you allow interference. And that's why I'm saying if you can control this extra degree of freedom, you're okay. You can erase observations. But if you don't, then it's as good as collapsed, so to speak, as good as observed.
Yeah, what is really tricky there is capturing the entire envelope of information so that all of
I agree. Absolutely.
that is not easy.
You're absolutely right.
And that's why erasure is possible under very controlled circumstances.
You're absolutely right. Another beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my clock that I'm running slightly late, but it's a very interesting point. Maybe I can just reply it in this following simple way. People who are doing diffraction of larger and larger molecules, a bit like Marcus Arndt does really brilliantly in Vienna. When they do that, I think initially people who didn't believe that these molecules would diffract, one of the arguments was that it's enough to emit a single photon. That's exactly your point, in fact. And this photon escapes very quickly to effectively infinity, that you're never going to be able to capture them all back and interfere them together. But the lucky thing for that experiment is that the photons were such a large wavelength corresponding to the internal vibrations, that wavelength didn't give you any information. It was larger than the separation between the two slits. So it's very clever. It's not enough to entangle to your environment, but it must be the right kind of entanglement that destroys the coherence that you are testing. And that's also, there's lots of interesting things to be said about this.
Very much a Feynman thing, because Feynman talks at great length about the wavelength issues.
That's it. And I love to talk exactly at that level. I'm a big fan.
Cool.
Great. Thank you. I'm sorry that I have to leave it at this, but because it's a really interesting discussion.
Some other time.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So maybe we will stop here, and thank you, Vlatko.
Thanks very much.
Very, very interesting talk, and maybe next time.
Next time. I really enjoyed it. I'm happy to engage in another discussion if you invite me in the future. It will be great.
So thank you, everyone, for
Thanks very much.
us, and thank you, Vlatko, again.
Thank you.
See you
Pleasure.
next
Thank you.